So I welcome everyone to this motivational dialogue. And as you see, I'm not Luke, who's moderating this meeting. Yeah. I stand in for him because he got quite private matters to handle with, and so I sent his apologize on his behalf. And yeah, as you all know, I think they're just all know how the Zoom meetings are going on, but I give a short introduction in it. At the beginning, if Chris Hudson is starting his speech, good morning, Chris Hudson, officially. I will mute you all, and after the speech, you please unmute yourself, and please use the raising hands button if you have questions afterwards. And now I hand over to Robert that he could introduce Chris to us.
Thank you, Pascal. Well, yes, for those of you who don't know him or perhaps don't know his history, Reverend Chris Hudson is the minister at All Souls Unitarian Church in Belfast and is moderator of the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland. But more importantly for today, he led the peace organisation, the Peace Train, in direct discussion with the loyalist paramilitaries in Ireland and the Dublin government, which ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm not going to say any more because I will say something then that pinches Chris's thunder, as it were. So, Chris, over to you. And yeah, let's hear about Ireland and how it could apply in other places around the world.
Okay, well, you can all hear me now, yes. Well, thank you very much, Robert, for your kind introduction. And also thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you this morning. And also, it is wonderful to see so many familiar faces, people I haven't seen for a long time. So greetings to you all. And I hope you're all keeping very well under these very unusual circumstances. And hopefully we will have the opportunity to meet again in the near future. I was thinking the other day, I was watching a news item, and it was on the BBC, and the broadcaster was announcing that people could now visit care homes. They could visit their elderly relatives in care homes. And by pure accident, he said, they will be able to say, "I want to hold your hand." And immediately came to my mind was the Beatles song all those years ago, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And I think that should become the anthem of us all as we move towards the vaccines and hopefulness, and the fact that the vaccines will allow us to meet, hug, and as the Beatles sang all those years ago, "I want to hold your hand." So I hope that will become the anthem of the world within the next few weeks. It might become the number one for Christmas if I can spread it quickly enough. Anyway, once again, thank you for inviting me to speak. And because it's a motivational dialogue, I've broken my piece, my address, into three parts. And the first part is peace organizations. And the second part is engaging with the protagonists. And the third part is ongoing work. Now, in the first part, peace organizations, as Robert mentioned, I was associated with an organization called the Peace Train, which literally held events where we would travel from Dublin to Belfast on a train as a protest against the ongoing violence of particularly the IRA, because they were attacking the railway line and putting bombs on the railway line. And that was only one peace organization amongst many others. There was the Peace People, there was church initiatives for peace, there were Women for Peace, various peace groups, all operating to try and bring the conflict in Northern Ireland to an end. And of course, the trade union movement had its own events where it would bring thousands of people onto the street to protest against terrorist violence, or as we call it in Northern Ireland, paramilitary violence. And people probably will be aware that on one side you had the IRA, and on the other side you had the Protestant paramilitaries, the UVF and the UDA. And then you had the British Army and the security forces. So you had three protagonists involved in the conflict in Northern Ireland. And the peace groups, for many, many years, organized events, carried out campaigns, usually after an atrocity, where a number of people would be killed in an attack on a building, say a restaurant, a public house, or whatever. Where you'd have a large number of people killed, people would take to the street and carry out a protest. Now, that was important because the most important thing was to clearly show to those who were involved in violence, those who were trying to achieve their ends through violence. It was correct for public manifestations to show that they had no popular support for their violence, because no paramilitary or terrorist organization can really survive or operate if they don't have communal support. So these groups had a level of support within their immediate communities, but it was important for all these peace groups to show that they didn't have popular support. So for years, people were holding various protest marches, church events, and with us, the peace train. And we ran peace trains between Dublin and Belfast, and we ran a peace train from Holyhead in Wales to London, where we met with politicians and had a resolution passed in the House of Commons supporting the peace train. I was chair of the peace train, and more by accident than by design, at one meeting in Dublin, I was invited to speak at. I was speaking on the same platform as a gentleman from Northern Ireland who was there as a social worker. Well, I learned he wasn't really a social worker. He was actually a member of the UVF. And the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, was probably one of the most lethal paramilitary organizations. And myself and him, after the event, engaged with each other. And he asked me, would I like to come and meet with the UVF in Belfast? Now, I'm going to add something in here, why I decided to meet with him. I could have said no, because he was involved in terrorism and I wouldn't meet him. But I remember at one event I was speaking, and a Catholic priest, a priest by the name of Father Des Wilson, not somebody I would ever have agreed with on, not someone I would have agreed with on many issues. I would have absolutely disagreed with him on most issues. I even suspected he had a level of sympathy to the IRA. But he said one thing that made me think. And it's always interesting in life when somebody that you're not too fond of or somebody you're not sure of says something that you know that there's a truth in it. In other words, it's often difficult to learn from those that you don't particularly like. And yet I learned a lesson from this man. He said, if holding protest marches, if holding peace trains, if letting off peace doves, if letting off white balloons and holding all these great manifestations of peace, well, if that's the sum total of your peace work, then you can stuff it. Now, stuff it is a very rude thing to say. I think Robert would know that as well. To say stuff it is very rude. But he was right. We were reassuring ourselves that we were peaceful people. And I'm not diminishing the work of all the peace groups, but it's important. But at the same time, it is not the specific way that you bring around the end of conflict. And that's why I'm moving on to point 2. Because when I met this man who was in the UVF, I agreed to engage with them because of a sermon, and I'm sure many of you know him, Reverend Bill Darlison, who was minister in the Dublin church. Bill gave a sermon where he said at that sermon that really you bring peace when you engage with the protagonists. And we all know that from the Beatitudes in the Bible, blessed are the peacemakers. Well, who becomes the peacemakers? When I engaged with, and I'll use the word terrorists, it was ironic that they were the people who had to become the peacemakers, because there could be no political progress in Ireland, particularly in Northern Ireland, until the conflict ended. So I moved from peace campaigning to conflict resolution. I specifically turned my back on peace campaigning, on taking part in various peace campaigns, like the Peace Train and other protests, and completely involved myself in conflict resolution by meeting with the UVF. So I worked with the UVF from early 93 up until their ceasefire in October in 94. So instead of campaigning for peace, I was now in dialogue for peace with the very people who were doing the killing. It was uncomfortable, it was difficult, and it was scary at times because my own life was in danger at times. Now, I knew on the other side that there was a priest, a number of priests, one in particular, Father Alec Reid, who was in dialogue with the IRA. And it was very important that we didn't try to be in dialogue with both sets of paramilitaries, because you could be perceived as spying on one and informing on the other, whatever way. So I specifically made my task an engagement with the loyalists, the Protestant paramilitary organizations, and particularly the UVF. And for the best part of those 2 years, I would bring messages from them to the Dublin government. I would speak to the British ambassador in Dublin, and we would go through what they were saying and see, was there anything in what they were saying there was a movement towards peace. I believed all the time there was, because they reassured me from the very beginning that they were serious. They wanted to work towards peace, but they didn't know how to do it. They knew how to carry on conflict, but they didn't know how to make the conflict end. And that's a very interesting thing for all conflict throughout the world. And that is, sometimes there are people engaged in conflict and they know how to keep the conflict going, but they don't have the skill set or the knowledge to bring the conflict to an end, or they don't have those people to facilitate them bringing the conflict to the end. The gentleman that I met, a man called David Irvine, who had been in prison for a few years, for trying to plant a bomb. He was a very intelligent man. He has since died from a heart attack. And he was a very articulate man. And I was able to shape what he said to me and pass it on to the Irish government and other officials. And interesting, he once described me in a book. He said, Chris Hudson set the mood music in which they could operate and in which they could talk to people they wouldn't normally talk to. And eventually, the Irish government, in discussion with the British government, produced a document called the Downing Street Declaration. And the Prime Minister of Britain at the time was John Major, and the Irish Prime Minister was a man called Albert Reynolds. And in that Downing Street Declaration, there was one line that was suggested by myself. So when these people, the paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, saw that one line, they knew that they were being considered in the dialogue, that they were being taken seriously. And the one line was simply this, that no matter what happens, there would be no constitutional change to Northern Ireland without the will of the people in Northern Ireland. In other words, Northern Ireland would stay part of the United Kingdom as long as the people of Northern Ireland wished it to be part of the United Kingdom. But however, other parts of the document spelled out changes to facilitate the nationalist community and better relations with the Republic of Ireland. I won't go into all of that, but because there's a lot of material in that, which eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement, which basically improved the relationship between the two states and Ireland and so forth. But on October the 13th, the people that I was in dialogue with, the loyalist paramilitaries, on October the 13th, 1994, they declared their ceasefire 2 weeks after the IRA declared their ceasefire. And the difference was the IRA declared a ceasefire from anonymous sources, just put out a message that they were calling a ceasefire. The loyalists held a press conference where they actually appeared, and people now were able to put faces on the leaders of loyalist paramilitaries. And in their statement, they said, "We express true remorse for all the innocent people that we have harmed." Now, that was at my suggestion and other people's suggestions, that as well as declaring a ceasefire, they should also include some gesture to the innocent victims of the conflict, which they did. They saw it as a universal gesture, that they didn't want now to address each and every single issue of atrocities that were carried out on their behalf. That was 1994, and in 98 we had the Good Friday Agreement. But the divisions haven't gone away. So I've dealt with part one, which was peace organizations, campaigning for peace, and part two, which was working with paramilitaries, working with the terrorists, turning the protagonists into the peacemakers, which was part two. Part three, which I'll finish up with, is post-ceasefire peace, post-Good Friday peace, because the divisions in Northern Ireland have not gone away. There are two distinct groups of people, one who see themselves as Irish, and the other group that see themselves as British as well as Irish. So that division is still there. There's a growing central group, and they are people who describe themselves as Northern Irish, and they're a growing constituency. They're more moderate in their thinking, more progressive in their social outlook, and they see themselves as being Northern Irish before they see themselves as being Irish or British. So they don't enter into what I would call the hardline nationalist argument. However, the divisions still exist within particularly working class areas. The area where I work with Protestant working class, many of them feel they gained nothing from the peace, from the Good Friday Agreement. They feel that there was no dividend for them in peace. And in many cases, they are the lowest achievers in education, highest unemployment spots, not as bleak as they think they are, but sometimes people have a great ability to think that they're actually worse off than they actually are. So it's not as bleak as they state, but I can see the arguments that play out in their community. And in those communities, the loyalist paramilitaries still exist. They haven't dissolved or gone away. And in a report this week, it stated there were 12,500 members of loyalist paramilitary organizations. And on the Republican side, the IRA have gone away, although they're there in name, but there are smaller fractious groups, smaller Republican groups, with about 400 members, according to the police, and some of them are involved in carrying out attacks and so forth. Very, very little, because they've been completely infiltrated by MI5, the British intelligence operator, and they've been infiltrated by the Irish Special Branch Police. So they're forever being caught and put behind bars. But on the loyalist side, they are not involved in any paramilitary violence. They've stuck to their ceasefire, but some of them are involved in crime and drug dealing. Not only a small amount, but it's worrying because it has an impact on their communities. So that's the area I'm working with now, is to try and get the loyalist paramilitary groups to transform from being paramilitary organizations to civilianized organizations. We have been successful with one smaller group. There was a small third group, and they have become completely now involved in community work. They run a community centre in part of Belfast City, and they run cultural projects around their own marching bands, the 12th of July, all of that, celebrating Orange Day in Northern Ireland. But the main groups are still regard themselves as paramilitary. However, they don't do any training. They don't do any spying on anyone. So essentially, many of them have gone through transformation. But occasionally, some of their members, some of the more maverick members, the ones that can't be controlled, are involved in drugs, all sorts of crime, and occasionally in murders. And only last year, they murdered one man in part of Belfast, where I was at his funeral, and thousands of people turned out to protest at his funeral. Having said that, anyone who has visited Northern Ireland since 1998 or even 1994 cannot but help but notice the transformation in Northern Ireland. It has completely transformed. Belfast City has new buildings. Naturally, with the pandemic, everything has come to a standstill, but it's beginning to take off again. And the British government intend to encourage investment into Belfast and Derry City. We now have a large immigrant population. I have members of my church who are asylum seekers from Zimbabwe, Iran, and now Uganda, who have joined the church recently. And some of the churches in my locality work very, very well with the immigrant communities. There has been some tension, some racism against the immigrants from within poorer working class areas, but we're working on that. And believe it or not, so are the loyalist paramilitary organizations. they're working with us against racism. One of them actually went as far as running a campaign to support gay people. And so this is progress. If you think these are people that years ago were involved in murders and killings and bombings, and now they're working on social issues, even though they haven't given up the organizations that they were originally in. Let me just put it this way, and I'll finish up with this. When I go back to 93, I remember sitting at a table with about 7 or 8 other men. And all of those men had at least killed one person. And most of them had done anything between 10 or 15 years in jail. And they were sitting opposite me. And I was working with them to try and get them to call a ceasefire and work towards peace. Some of those men from natural causes have died, but only recently I was sitting around a Zoom conference with them, with some of the same men. And now they're talking about an educational project with Stranmillis University in Belfast. They're talking about working with Maynooth College in Dublin. They meet regularly with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, and they even accept money from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs to run cross-community projects. So I'll finish up by saying this. I've dealt with it in 3 parts. Part 1 was protesting, complaining, organizing against conflict. Part 2 was probably the most specific bit, engaging with the protagonists to create peace. And now part 3, which is organizing to build on the peace. Because we have never been here before, where this is the first time we've done this. And we've got to be conscious that when politicians walk away from the conflict on the ground, it's ordinary people and the churches and others who have to continuously work to maintain the peace and to build on it. As one man said, and he's an ex-paramilitary, he said, it takes an awful lot. You have to do an awful lot to make sure nothing happens. So that speaks for itself. In order to make sure there isn't a violent act, you have to do an awful lot to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's what we're doing at the moment. We're continually building capacity at ground level, not just the small group I'm with, but other groups. And I'll give you one example. I am the chair of a project in Belfast called Resolve. And Resolve is a restorative justice project. It was initially created by paramilitary organizations to more or less keep law in their own community. And by keeping law, they were rather brutal. If some young fella robbed something or broke into a house, they broke his legs. As simply as that. And in some cases, they shot people in the legs. And if people were drug pushing, they actually shot them dead. But now the project that I'm head of, Resolve, that is to stop crime in the area. But we have the police sitting on the project. I'm the chair. We have got some of the former paramilitaries working on the project, and we are financed by the International Red Cross. And that project is working extremely well. If there's an attack on an immigrant family, we get involved. And we meet, as the police will say, we can have a dialogue that they can't have. Because the police can't go along and ask someone not to commit a crime, whereas we can. So they're the things that have grown out. And a matter of fact, one chief constable in England said he would love to have a project like Resolve in his catchment area because he thinks they're very innovative and working well. So that just shows you what has grown out of the piece. But at the same time, it needed a lot of investment, a lot of money, putting people back to work. And thankfully, some of our friends in America particularly George Mitchell and Bill Clinton when he was president. And we hope now that Joe Biden will also be helpful in helping us to build Northern Ireland back up. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, just clapping hands a bit, yeah, because I'm now really happy to be part of IRF and to be informed about such things. I didn't get in touch all over the time. My birthday year is 1989, and so I didn't get in touch with this all. Oh, okay, I get in touch with it in school, but not this far. So thank you very much. Next is we have the time for questions, and please, if anyone like to ask Chris some further questions or details, use the raising hands icon. You'll find it on the button with participants. And yeah, Patchman just raised his hand, and I know Robert has a question, so we start with Patchman and Wolfgang. Please, Patchman.
Hi, Chris. How are you? Thank you very much for such an informative talk that you gave to us today.
Thank you, Patchman.
No, at all. Chris, what do you think the situation is going to change, if any, when the UK leaves the EU?
Well, Benjamin, the first thing is the UK have actually left the EU. What we're doing now is trying to agree a trade deal, and which will kick in by the 1st of January. And so, in other words, although the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, have left the European Union, we still have the same arrangements governing just about everything, which was called the transitionary period. And during those discussions around leaving the European Union, there has been a lot of debate about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because everybody was agreed that it's important we don't have a physical border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And I just explain what that means. After the Good Friday Agreement, all the military infrastructure that existed around the border was all taken away. So you were no longer stopped by the army or the police crossing into the north or going south. All of that's gone. And through both our involvements in the European Union with the single market, there was very little difference in tariffs, north and south. So there were no customs. But the customs disappeared long before the military paraphernalia disappeared. So, Pejman, I think both the UK government, the Irish government, and including the European Union are determined that there will be no infrastructure on the border, or only no invasive infrastructure. To be fair to the British government, they've made it quite clear they will not put up any infrastructure, and there will be no military bases, nothing on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, there is some talk about a border down the Irish Sea where, and I'll try and explain this as best I know it. If goods coming in from the United Kingdom, if goods coming in from Great Britain into Northern Ireland are going on to the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU, there will have to be customs checks in Scotland and in England to check those goods. So in other words, you will have customs checks between one part of the United Kingdom and another, which is Northern Ireland. So this is kind of a no-win situation, because Northern Ireland unionists, who are the people who regard themselves as British, strongly object to any internal customs checks. They are of the view that there should be no customs checks between one part of the United Kingdom and another. But equally, they don't want any customs checks between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland because they see the benefit of that. My own personal view, and it might be a bit cynical, but it is my own personal view. I honestly believe people have been using this as a negotiating position in the discussions between the United Kingdom and the European Union. I know the British government in part have been using it, and I've no doubt that the European Union is equally using it as a negotiating position to try and initially to force Britain to stay in the European Customs Union. I think that was the initial reason it was done, to try, because there would be no need for a border if the whole of the United Kingdom was in the European Customs Union. And then, of course, Theresa May signed up to that. But then when Boris got in, he said, no way, we're not staying in the EU Customs Union. So that created a friction about the Irish border. I say this because for most of my life, I was a trade union official and I worked at negotiations. And you use everything you possibly can in negotiations to try and unsettle the people you're negotiating with. So I've no reason to believe that, I can't remember the man's name who's negotiating on the United Kingdom's behalf, but I've no doubt that Michel Barnier would be quite capable of doing what I did when I was a trade union official, and that is you unsettle your opponent. But I'm firmly of the belief that when there is an agreement, and I think there will be a trade agreement within the next week, it looks like it's almost there, I do believe that there will be no infrastructure on the Irish border. Everybody has an invested interest in that, and that won't happen. I think both parties will understand that. And therefore, to answer Pejman's question, there will be no tension in Northern Ireland because of a border between, a physical border between the Republic and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Chris. Just for clarification, I meant the negotiations between the UK and the EU, which is ongoing. And it's in the news currently. Not so much the leave, but the basis of us leaving the EU. That's what I meant.
Thank you. So next is Wolfgang.
Hello. Thank you, and thank you for your words. I think we met. I heard them already in Cologne, and we met in Belfast. I guess it was in a time about 2009, about with Witzke, and what was and Gudrun as well. And in this time, the situation in Belfast seems quite stable. When you move into the city, was no problem. We have been with Tim Brandis, also I remember in a hotel bar after the meeting, and a lot of young people drinking and dancing, and it seems to be relaxed. But when I talk to the Reverend, or to the lady cooking tea in the church, I felt, they told us still under the relaxed situation, it's still not resolved. As I said, there was at the beginning was a social problem. It was not only religion; it was only a social splitting, and you have still the so-called peace wall. And Bobby Sands, it's still on the wall. And I think what is the future? Besides the EU, just in the groups themselves, between those groups, do they still need that peace wall? Is the gate still closed? And what is your idea for the future?
Thank you, Wolfgang. And actually, Wolfgang, we most certainly did meet in Belfast, and we met in Cologne, but we also met in Mannheim as well.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And yes, that's a very good question, and I'll deal with it in a couple of parts, because yes, to begin with, at the beginning, Wolfgang, when the conflict broke out in Northern Ireland, initially going right back to 1968, it would be wrong to suggest it was only because of religion. You're absolutely right. There was another issue, and the issue was that Catholics in Northern Ireland, in many cases at local level, they were denied the vote, or else there was gerrymandering. Constituencies were made up in such a way that even where Catholics had a majority, they elected less local politicians than the Protestant community. It was called gerrymandering. It was the fixing of boundaries. It happens in other countries as well, but it was so clearly easy to observe in Northern Ireland, because you could have a part of Derry City where you would have 80,000 Catholics living, and they elected, say, 6 local politicians. And then you had a constituency beside that, which had 60,000 Protestants, and they elected 8 local politicians. So you can see how it was manufactured to make sure the Catholic population were underrepresented. And because of that, it led to other things. It led to jobs. Catholics were more likely to be unemployed than Protestants. And also, there was a higher level of emigration from the Catholic community. And then you had, because for a good part before the British Labour Party introduced free education right up to 3rd level, Catholics had less opportunity to go to university. Now, having said that, Protestant working class people were not necessarily an awful lot better off. But you know the old saying, Wolfgang, if you tell a man somebody else is less than him, it makes him feel slightly better, even if he's not living a great life anyway. But once he knows there's somebody worse off, then it makes his life a bit more bearable, allegedly. So that's what started in '68, the Civil Rights Campaign for Catholics, which was based very similar on the Civil Rights Campaign in America. And in the early 70s, all that they looked for was actually achieved. Housing was taken out of the hands of local politicians, and they set up a housing executive for the whole of Northern Ireland with no politicians involved. Education, right up to 3rd level, was free for everybody. And many Catholics will actually tell you that was the great change in their life when they could go to 3rd level education. And now you see in Northern Ireland many doctors, legal people, senior police officers, business people, all coming from the Catholic community. And that was mostly thanks to the initiative of the British Labour government bringing in 3rd level education free in the United Kingdom as a whole. So all of that has been dealt with. What we would have called the discrimination against Catholics is now gone. However, and again, Wolfgang, you're right, it would be wrong to see this purely as a religious divide, because as less and less people are going to church, people might be baptized a Catholic, baptized a Protestant, but it doesn't really play out in their life. They're not religious anymore. So the obvious demarcation is now Irish and British. I feel Irish and he feels British. And that creates a division. And then the ongoing social problems in areas where people underprivilege, where there's tension there. I touched on it earlier on, where people felt they didn't gain much from what was called the peace dividend. Now, when peace money came in from Europe, from the European Union, peace money from America, a lot of it went to big infrastructure projects. It went to people in the hospitality business, and some of it made its way into the poorer neighborhoods. But they would argue they didn't see as much from the peace dividend as others. So we still have those ongoing social problems. We still have, with the impact of Brexit, how will that play out? Because people, particularly nationalists in Northern Ireland identified more with being European than Protestants, although Northern Ireland did vote to stay in the European Union, unlike England and Wales. But so there's a bit of tension there. But I'm optimistic that a lot of that will it won't lead to violence. It'll lead to disagreement. It'll lead to political fallout. And then with on top of that, the pandemic, which is having an impact. But we are hoping that the British government will pump enough money into infrastructure building, into keeping people, the public services going, all that type of thing. Will help overcome the difficulties we face.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, next question comes from Witzke. Please.
Yeah, thank you. You already briefly touched on the subject of my question, the involvement of politics, or the influence of politics on it, also international politics, and also of the big international peacekeepers, so to speak. I've been involved in a summer school of the Conference of European Churches, and one of the items there was reporting hate crime. Now, I wonder very much, how does that come into the Northern Irish situation? Does it do any good, or is it for the worse, really? Does it make things worse? And same along those lines, I'm very eager to know how you feel about are politicians leading the way to peace or obstructing it?
Yeah, thank you, Witzke. I think that's a very good question, because most of the peace is made at local level. And it's the unsung heroes that build the peace. I'm thinking of women in communities, I'm thinking of social workers, and indeed the churches. Because with the immigrant population, with the asylum seekers, the refugees, the churches have played a significant role at community level. Because interesting enough, in Northern Ireland, there's still a certain regard for churches and the role they play in the community. So they have been able to run projects in communities in order to help the community accept and meet with immigrants from different countries. And it's also been helpful that some of the immigrant groups have found their way into some of the churches, and it has given them immediately a sense of community. And you asked the question about politicians. Of course, politics are essential because we elect people to our various parliaments, and in Northern Ireland, we elect people to our assembly, and we expect them to do a job. But the politicians, unfortunately, equally play games, and they always feel they're playing back into their own constituency. And in that sense, unfortunately, in Northern Ireland at the moment, the politicians, particularly the two main parties, Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party, are not playing the role they should be playing. They still play a part. They still play what I would call a partisan role, and they still play, to use a word that most people would be aware of, they play a tribal game with each other. Even with the pandemic, we've had disagreement over how we should apply closing of shops and closing of public houses and everything. Even the disagreement that they inherit plays into dealing with the pandemic. Now, Vitska, you also asked about on an international scale. This is why if we have that happening locally, you can be pretty sure that people will bring a very specific message to other politicians when they're speaking to them, including the European Union. And I think the European Union has to be very careful, at least those involved in the negotiations, not to play politics equally with the Irish situation. And I did mention that I believed in part that Michel Barnier was playing politics in overemphasizing the Irish situation vis-a-vis the border. Now, it wasn't completely his fault. He was being encouraged by the Irish government because the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, was equally playing his card in all of this. And our biggest fear at the moment is now that Trump will be gone in January and Joe Biden will come in, Joe Biden has been singing and dancing about his Irish roots and how he loves Ireland. Now, we just hope that Joe Biden will be a bit careful and that he won't be partisan in dealing with Northern Ireland. I don't think he will. I think he will have good people around him, like the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Tony Blinken is a man full of wisdom. He was the advisor to Barack Obama. He's dealt with issues around the Middle East in the past. And he's lived in Europe, and he's a wise man. And I'm sure he will be a guiding hand with Joe Biden in how he deals with Ireland. And usually what an American president does, and this is very important, an American president will always appoint a special envoy to Northern Ireland. So I hope Joe Biden, as soon as he's, within weeks after becoming president, will select a very good person. I don't know whom. I could throw him a few names, but he'll pick his own person. And that person would become the special envoy to Northern Ireland. And that person will inform the American government on what role it should play in Northern Ireland. And in actual fact, it might be a bad idea for the European Union to think in that way as well, and to have a special envoy in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. Next, Robert, you like to ask a question? Yeah.
Chris, I wanted to sort of build on what Wolfgang said. So this is not about politicians and the leaders. This is about the young people on the streets and on the ground. And I'm assuming that in part they were committed, and I'm going back to the Troubles now really, or at least to begin with. I'm assuming that they were committed to the cause, but a lot of them were also involved in criminal activity, like theft, and particularly gratuitous violence, where that was sort of almost supported by the organizations that existed, the IRA and the UVF. So I wondered if we should consider that an accident of birth. So if you were born and grew up in that community at that time, that place, you were almost bound to behave in the way that they did. And so what happens now? And I wondered if you could sort of summarize the key things that are needed to change the hearts and minds of those communities and the people growing up in them, so that we don't have a repeat of the violence and and all the other problems that we had.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. You can't you can't actually blame people who came from certain conditions for getting involved in the paramilitary organizations, whether that was young kids from a nationalist area who joined the IRA, or young people from a Protestant neighborhood who joined the UVF or the UDA. I would see how the circumstances could have led them to do that. The ones that I would blame were the cheerleaders on the sideline who, living in faraway places, cheered on these young people as they went out to kill each other and to kill others. So when we engaged with them to try and bring around the ceasefire, because they were the people who were the rank and file of paramilitary organizations, we brought them in from the cold, and we played with a dangerous thing there, Robert, and that's this. We brought paramilitary organizations into the body of politics. In order to bring peace, we engaged with them, but we brought them into the body of politics. And in a way, we clouded democracy, and we had an ambiguity which still exists. And I still struggle with that ambiguity. And the ambiguity is that even the police in Northern Ireland and the politicians meet regularly with paramilitary leaders to try and get issues resolved. You might even say there's a big hullabaloo because seemingly the Archbishop of Canterbury had an event in Lambeth Palace earlier this year, Justin Welby, where he had people from the UVF there. And all hell is broken loose because here's the Archbishop of the Church of England entertaining terrorists or former terrorists to see can he help. And that has created a big stir now because some politicians are saying the man's a fool and he shouldn't have done it. However, I'm not going to criticize him. He believed he was doing the right thing. But yes, we did cloud the area of the division between democracy and paramilitary. And as I said, we struggle with that. We struggle with the time Mo Molan, when she was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and a wonderful person, and Mo Molan went into the prison to engage in dialogue with the paramilitaries, with the prisoners who were coming out. In no other country would people do that. Well, at least they wouldn't do it so publicly. I'm sure Israel engages with Hamas at some level, but they're not going to do it in public. And I'm sure that happens in most other countries. We did it in public, and maybe we were right, and maybe the British government were right, and the Irish government, and they engaged through people like me. But I'm going to say something to you now which you might find a little bit worrying. The issues that exist in urban areas in Northern Ireland are not really that different than the issues that exist in urban areas throughout the UK or throughout even other European cities. I mean, drug crime, gangs, violent gangs. Look at in London with the high level of violent crimes, young men killing each other with knives, and many of that within immigrant communities. And yet, funny enough, in Northern Ireland, that's at a lower level than it would be in any other UK city. I don't know about the rest of Europe, but I'm sure people could give me stats on German cities or on French cities. We know there's a lot of problems in French cities. And I was really surprised to hear a chap called Gordon Ramsay, now not to be confused with the chef. This is a different Gordon Ramsay. He lectures in the Queen's University, Belfast. He's a former soldier. He was a squaddy, and Robert would know what a squaddy is, a rank and file British soldier who served in Northern Ireland, who, although he served as a soldier in Northern Ireland, he fell in love with the place. He educated himself in England and came back and got a job as a university lecturer in Queen's University. And he purposely lives in a poor Protestant neighborhood. And he goes one step further. He even plays in one of the marching bands. He has totally ingratiated himself into the local community. But he wrote recently that in some ways, the paramilitaries have a benign influence in their community. Yes, some members are involved in prostitution, drugs, crime, but not all of them. But they have a benign influence because he said, coming from England, he knows cities in England, and there's areas in those cities where the police actually don't go, and where the police hardly even operate, and where the police respond very slowly to various crimes and so forth. Whereas he said, rightly or wrongly, in some constituencies, some urban areas in Northern Ireland, people turn to the paramilitaries, and the paramilitaries will react quicker than the police. And he points out that in some areas, because of that, there is much lower crime rates than other parts of the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not making an argument in favor. I'm just saying that as a reality. And I have heard one person on a phone-in program on BBC saying, we could do with some of those lads over here in our neighborhood. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can see how that is one of the reasons why the paramilitaries still exist. Because in some cases, local people look to them to keep the law because they feel the police are slow to react. As I said, I'm only stating that as a fact, not as something that I would advocate. I hope that helps, Robert, with your question.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, next we got Gudrun.
My question was asked by Payman already, but there's one thing I want to point out. I was in Belfast at the conference 2008, and there I learned so much about the conflict there, and all my wisdom from this conference helped me to understand all this Brexit difficulty. And to me, it shows how important our conferences are. And just a short notice, a few days ago, some of us started to plan a video conference in next May, and maybe Pascal, you want to say something about now that there are people in this community. Thank you, Chris, for your speech. It was so good to see you again.
Well, Gudrun, good to see you. And I did watch the movie you gave me all those years ago, even though I had no English subtitles. I had Sprecher bisschen Deutsch, so I was able to follow it, and it was wonderful. Thank you. And can I just say, in response to what you said, yes, our conferences are very important, and it should remember that the non-subscribing Presbyterians were very involved in setting up integrated education in Northern Ireland, going back all those years, and that the IARF supported the non-subscribers in their campaign for integrated education. And if I remember right, I think even funding at that time came from the IARF many years ago, when integrated education was set up in Northern Ireland. And the school, Lagan School, is still going. It's stronger than ever. And another school has started in Belfast called Hazelwood, which is over 1,000 students. And in many cases, Catholics are now going to schools that would have been described as Protestant schools. There's more mixing in those schools. The sad bit of it is the Catholic Church, sadly, is still completely opposed to integrated education. And so is the Sinn Féin political party, opposes integrated education. Whereas when President Obama visited Northern Ireland a number of years ago, he said that was the key to bringing young people together. Bringing people together. It doesn't necessarily mean they change who they are, but they learn a little bit about the other person. And yes, our conferences have played a role in that dialogue. So we can be quite proud of the role that we've played. and our church, the non-subscribing Presbyterians, and of course our sister church, the General Assembly of Unitarians in England. So thank you, Gudrun.
Yeah, thank you. I got a hint from Heidi that Charanjit just raised the hand often. So Charanjit, you have the chance to ask your question now, if there is one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, for a great talk again. My question is, it seems to be that we have been only talking about men. Could you tell us a little bit about women's role in bringing together peace of some sort?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question. And I'm wonderful to see you. Every time I see you, I always picture you sitting up on the Giant's Causeway. And both of you saying, this is the best bit of our visit to Northern Ireland.
Yes, you can see the world.
Yeah, that's Andrew, that's a superb question. And it's very important because you're absolutely right. Throughout most of the conflict, politics were dominated by men. And of course, the paramilitary organizations were dominated by men. Now, people will try and rewrite history, and you'll get some people saying, oh no, women played a more significant role. But it isn't true. But however, when I spoke earlier on about the peace organizations, the women played a major role in the peace organizations. And I did mention one organization, which was Women for Peace. And the first big peace rallies that were organized in Northern Ireland were organized by women. And even, I remember one of the funniest things, I remember when I was invited after the Loyalist ceasefire to speak at a conference of a small political party which was associated with the Loyalist paramilitaries. And when I went to the conference, most of the delegates were women. And when I asked the chairman of the conference, why are most of the delegates women? He said, because all the men are in prison. So he said, these are their wives, their sisters and that. But the wives and sisters actually put resolutions down to the conference that were more progressive than the men would have. And, you know, it's interesting to see in Northern Ireland now, which would have had a sort of a paternalistic society, we see that 3 of our political parties are led by women. The Sinn Féin is led by Michelle O'Neill. The Democratic Unionist Party is led by Arlene Foster. And the centrist Liberal Party Alliance is led by a very formidable woman, Naomi Long. And in my own constituency where I live, out of 5 of the members of the Assembly, 3 are women. And my local MP is a woman, Claire Hanna, from the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, and she's now sitting in the House of Commons. And I took part in a Zoom event that she organised 2 weeks ago. So yes, in the initial stages of the conflict, I suppose to answer your question would be, the whole struggle around Irish republicanism and nationalism was a very male thing. And then initially the response from the Loyalists was a very male thing. But that has changed dramatically. And it's incredible now to see the role that women are playing. And within the police, the assistant chief constable is in Northern Ireland as a woman, and you see far more women on the beat as well, out in the police force and engaging in communities. And I'm delighted to say, in my own church, where since I became minister of All Souls, I've brought 4 people into full ministry. Well, one of them is a student minister. 2 men and 2 women. And dare I even say, the 2 men are gay men. So that's even one.
Right. So it's a very different world now.
Yeah. So and I have a wonderful student minister now, Linda Kane, and Linda is training to be minister under the guidance of the General Assembly of Unitarians and their new ministerial program in the UK. And Linda Kane is being trained to be a minister by them through a distance learning program. So yes, women were held back but have come to the fore now. And yet we shouldn't ignore, when we look at throughout Northern Ireland history, because I've been doing a bit of research and the role that women have played. Like a woman from my church was one of the first people to work on a certain type of surgery in the United Kingdom. And then we have a woman who is honoured on the plaque in our church, who was a nurse in the First World War and led the nursing during the bombing of Belfast. So to add that to the point that you made, I do think that women have been written out of the history of Northern Ireland as well, and it's time to start writing them back in. I've been doing some of that with people who've played roles in my own church.
Well done, Chris. And I hope the question which Robert Ince asked was in relation to the future. And if women are playing a bigger role now, is the future looking a bit brighter as a result?
Oh, I think so. I think I did mention Naomi Long, and Naomi is the leader of the Alliance Party, which is a centrist political party. And Naomi they have most certainly broken through recently, and they won a seat in the House of Commons, and they have about 10 members of the Northern Ireland Assembly. They have the controlling power on Belfast City Council, and so yes, so that's a very bright future. That and women play a big part in the Alliance Party, and so you can see that they are making a difference, and they're bringing a new dynamic. I don't want to put down men too badly. We do our best. I know we've been around a long time, but we're doing our best, and together, well, with women and men, we'll be a formidable team, as both of you are.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you all for your questions. I think we now got a good hour with the speech, and thank you, Chris, for this wide fields of informations. As I said, for me, really, really informating me. Are there any further questions from your side? Okay, good. Thank you for clapping hands. Yes, so I'm not informed about how the next motivational speech is planned. Robert, do you know something further?
Robert is muted.
No, yeah.
Right. I'm okay now. The plan is for sometime in January at a date we haven't tied down exactly, but it will be a Sunday, I can tell you that. Will be Yehuda from the Interfaith Encounter Association talking about Palestinian and the links, the interfaith dialogue between Jews, Palestinians, and Christians in Israel. Many of you know about that already, but he's going to bring his own angle to it. So that will be the next one. We do have them planned as far as April now. It should be about one a month. We will alternate between Saturdays and Sundays and try to get the timing so that alternately we can get people from the States if they get up early enough in the morning, or people from Japan if they want to go to bed late at night to join in. But the time zones around the world are pretty difficult to manage, in all honesty. So the next one will be in January. I hope that we'll be able to give people a bit more notice than we gave for this one, which was very unfortunate. Obviously, we've missed a lot of people, particularly our friends from India, although I did notice that Dr. Brown was with us. So good to see you again, Surendra. But for my thanks to Chris, it's been great, actually, I've known Chris quite a while, but just to hear the details of the stories has been rather wonderful. So thank you again, Chris. It's been great to have you here. And of course, the recording of this, somewhat edited, I suspect, will be available on our website shortly. So thank you to everybody for coming as well.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me. And I most certainly will be looking forward to Yehuda, because I was in Israel last year, and myself and Isabella, my wife, we had a lovely Shabbat meal with Yehuda, a very good discussion whilst we were in Israel with him, and I look forward to hearing him. But once again, thank you, everybody.